out of my head.
It's been a million years since I recorded for a variety of reasons we're not going to talk about right now. What I want to talk about is something I've been somewhat obsessed with, which is Enmix's lore. I'm actually rereading and annotating 1984 right now because I want to talk about the connections to Monopole, and that's something I will do in hopefully the near future, but that's a process that I want to give proper attention. In the meantime, we're still going to talk about Monopole because I want to talk about how I believe that Enmix kind of created Monopole, kind of. If you're unfamiliar with Enmix's lore, this is not really going to be an introductory video. I guess I could say Monopole is their equivalent of like the party in 1984. That's why I'm going to talk about the connections. It's an organization that is working against them in their attempts to reach Mixxtopia. That's like the basic explanation. But I want to talk about how I believe that Enmix kind of created Monopole. And the reason why I believe this is the case, first of all, Enmix they did create Mix. They talk about how it was like this box that was in their mind for a long time, but that's the wording that they used. So they created Mix, and Monopole is an organization that exists as part of Mixx. And they talk a lot about how they say that what they're not doing it because it's easy, they're doing it because it's hard. I believe that overcoming Monopole is something that it's hard to do, but that is very, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, it's something that could be very gratifying, and I'm going to keep bringing up 1984. One of the mottos of the party is freedom is slavery, and I don't believe that Enmix believe in this, but I do think that there is a weird way you could look at this statement, kind of like Nagito from Danganronpa-esque, where it's like Nagito was all about like ultimate hope comes from overcoming ultimate despair. I think that you could achieve your best self, I guess you could say, from overcoming extreme adversity, and Enmix are achieving their best selves through overcoming Monopole. Does that make sense? There's also the unknown adventurer being made up theory. Basically, there is this unknown adventurer that Monopole supports who has kind of made Mixx the way it is today. And because of Monopole's connections to the party in 1984, people have theorized that the unknown adventurer might not exist because in 1984, they kind of make up this villain, Goldstein. He's like thought of as the enemy of the ultimate enemy of the party, and he doesn't actually exist. He is kind of just like this way that they control the people of Oceania. They control them through creating this hatred for something outside of the party. And I understand where this theory comes from, and I think that it could be correct. But at the same time, part of me wonders if it makes sense because Goldstein was the enemy of the party. He wasn't part of the party. He was, against them. So like, would they, if it was based on the party, would they make up would they make up the person that they are backing, or would they make up their enemy? Not to say that Enmix is made up, but I do think that there are some blurred lines in terms of, who is the enemy and who is not the enemy, I guess you could say. I also think that specifically the New Frontier series has a lot of strange imagery, and that's like the beginning of the lore videos. So like, for me, a big thing that I've been noting is all of the instances in which green is represented a lot, because obviously later on they talk about Sweet Oasis and the green candy, and green is very much representative of Monopole. But for me, that makes me very curious about how green is represented throughout their lore. And in the New Frontier videos, there was a lot of like flora. There was a part where Haewon is growing flowers. There are these shots of like fields and everything. And so green is being green is being represented in a way where it's not inherently problematic. And maybe you can argue, okay, there's the natural green, and then there's the, synthetic green. But I do think that it's interesting the color has been represented in such different ways, because color is definitely important in Enmix's lore. I think that I haven't figured out exactly why, but in their lyrics, a lot of the time they mention the color blue. So I do feel that color is important. I just haven't put my finger on exactly why. And maybe other people have some theories, but definitely a lot throughout the lyrics they talk about the color blue. So blue is important, green is important, and green is represented in different ways. And maybe you can argue that that's not that strange. But there's also in the New Frontier video, I think it's the Mix You Imagine video, they're like reading this storybook, and you can see on the wall some like cat paw signs, which another thing that has been represented very differently, cats. There is the idea that the big cat is representative of their fears. At the same time, they talk about, pretending to be lions. The lion is symbolic of love, and you could even talk about like how they represent the lion, quote unquote, in the Love Me Like This video, even though that's represented by a dog. There's a lot to go off of there. But it's interesting that when they're talking about the foundations of Mixx, they have something referencing the cat, when the cat is supposed to be something that's brought in by Monopole in order to dissuade them from going on this big journey that they are starting. It's just odd that they're talking about how Mixx comes from their thoughts and there is a cat represented in their daily lives. It would make sense that the cat comes from their thoughts and the cat is tied to Monopole. So there's kind of an interesting through line here, I guess you could say. I also think it's interesting that when they're talking about impetus and emotions, they say that emotions become light like vapor. And this caught my attention because in 1984, when someone is like erased from existence, it's called being vaporized. So I think representing their emotions in a way that is nefarious in the context of 1984 is kind of interesting. There's also a video where they're talking about different things that they experience, and they talk about making mistakes, which is something that comes up a lot later, particularly in FE304 forward. We talk about how Kyujin keeps making mistakes, and that is putting the Enmix members' missions, I guess you could say, in jeopardy. It's interesting to me that when we first talk about mistakes in the lore, we see Jiwoo making some mistake while, I think, baking, and she smiles. She's like kind of embarrassed, but she's clearly joyful. And I just think representing mistakes in such different ways is a little bit strange. They also talk about how hope exists with disappointments. So it's kind of like blurring the lines between, certain things. They also talk about an ocean-like world that they have been dreaming of. I think it's interesting that in 1984, the nation that they are from is called Oceania. That's just a small connection, but it's odd that they're dreaming of a place that's like an ocean and they're making parallels to Oceania. Also, when they're talking about Mixxtopia, they say probably everything will be new and eternal and chained together in that world. That's how they word it. I think that chained together sounds a bit strange. That's just a small nitpick. I don't know what that means, and I think that sounds suspicious. There's also the idea of, does anxiety come from within you versus the outside? And the phrasing emphasizes like disparity and disconnect from the outside, but I think it's interesting that there is even the question of if the anxiety is coming from within you. So like, even though Enmix is portrayed as very different from Monopole, there's a connection that I think is being paralleled here. There's just a lot of questioning anxiety versus like inspecting and considering freedom, because they're tied together in the sense that it's like freedom of condemnation and existentialism. It's like you have the freedom to make choices, but at the same time, that's a condemnation because then you are responsible for all of the decisions that you do make. They also talk about apertures of freedom. Apertures is like an aperture is like a hole, and I think representing freedom in this way, where it's like a condemnation, it's a hole, is somewhat strange. There's also a video where someone is speaking. It's not clear entirely who, but they talk about how they reference the path that I truly desired. Again, I'm not sure who is speaking, but it's interesting how they develop this perspective, because we don't know who it is. It's talking about the past and what they did desire, which makes me think that they did something else. And I just think that having these different motivations is a little bit strange. All of that is to say, I know nothing about Enmix's lore. I mean, I do, but I'm very new to this world, so if I said something that is obviously not true, if I said something that obviously is true, and I made it sound like I'm saying something revolutionary, I am very new, I'm still figuring things out. Don't hate me, this is just me having fun. I'm really trying. I haven't recorded in so long because I have not been happy with what I've been making. So this is my attempt to return to the internet, and hopefully it was interesting. I always say that. I always say hopefully it was interesting. Do the things. I don't know.